Good evening and welcome to Novara Live. Apologies for a slightly late start tonight. We had a few tech issues, but our amazing producer, Darius, sorted them out as quickly as he could. My name's Stephen Methven, and tonight I'm joined by Kieran and Andreiu. Kieran, how are you doing? We had a big announcement just before we went live. We're going to cover it, but yeah, a bit of a rush at the end there.
Yes, absolutely. Well, aside from that, Stephen, in answer to your question, how am I doing? I think that this momentous occasion of our first pairing is somewhat overshadowed by the fact that I'm a bit under the weather, I'm sorry to report. Often in the comments, I've noticed people say, no doubt, well-wishing, Kieran sounds like he's got a cold, poor thing. And usually they're wrong. That's just the way I sound. But today they'd be right.
Well, you know what, Kieran? They wouldn't give the Lionesses a bank holiday, but maybe they'll give this debut one instead. Coming up tonight, we have an interview with one of the crew members of the humanitarian vessel Handala, part of the Gaza Freedom Flotilla, who is also a human rights lawyer. We'll cover a spat between Labour and Reform over the online safety bill and how that's sparking quite a bit of controversy, actually. And Keir Starmer has made a pretty shocking announcement on Gaza. If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. And as always, make sure to let us know your comments in the YouTube chat, or you can tweet at us on the hashtag Novara Live. Prime Minister Keir Starmer held an emergency meeting of his cabinet today to discuss the situation in Gaza. That meeting has now resulted in this address to the nation a little bit earlier this evening.
We need to see at least 500 trucks entering Gaza every day. But ultimately, the only way to bring this humanitarian crisis to an end is through a long-term settlement. So we are supporting the US, Egyptian and Qatari efforts to secure a vital ceasefire. That ceasefire must be sustainable, and it must lead to a wider peace plan, which we're developing with our international partners. This plan will deliver security and proper governance in Gaza and pave the way for negotiations on a two-state solution. Our goal remains a safe and secure Israel alongside a viable and sovereign Palestinian state. But right now, that goal is under pressure like never before. I've always said that we will recognise a Palestinian state as a contribution to a proper peace process at the moment of maximum impact for the two-state solution. With that solution now under threat, this is the moment to act. So today, as part of this process towards peace, I can confirm the UK will recognise the state of Palestine by the United Nations General Assembly in September, unless the Israeli government takes substantive steps to end the appalling situation in Gaza, agree to a ceasefire, and commit to a long-term sustainable peace, reviving the prospect of a two-state solution.
Now, I don't know why, and maybe it's just me, but Starmer looked, to be honest, pretty frightened while he was making that speech. He seemed to be shaking, or his voice appeared to be quivering anyway. And just to be clear on exactly what he said there, he threatened Israel with the recognition of a Palestinian state unless they found their way to a ceasefire. So unless they stopped ethnically cleansing, genociding, and attempting to forcibly transfer the Palestinians in Gaza, they would be hit with a Palestinian state. So he's using Palestinian statehood as a stick to try and get Israel to come into line, not only with the desires of Palestinians, but in fact with international law. Now, when asked by journalists why the recognition of a Palestinian state is a conditional, Starmer said the government's aim is to change the situation on the ground and, quote, this is intended to further that cause. Kieran, what did you make of that statement, that threat by Keir Starmer?
This should be a day for celebration. It should be a day for enormous celebration. I've dreamed of a better version of this day all my life, or at least since I understood that my family were Palestinian, and that meant something other than they had access to equal rights and so on and so on. Since I learned about Palestine, I've dreamt of a version of this day, and I want to feel emotional. I want to feel emotional about it. And in some ways I do, even though everything about this, my head says, it's impossible to feel exalted or optimistic. First of all, Stephen, as you alluded to, the first check on my optimism or, kind of emotional connection to the developments, the first check on that is that, as you said, Palestinian statehood is not being declared an inalienable right, as indeed we know it is. It's being used as a grubby little bargaining chip that still critically gives Israel veto power over our destiny. And one of the things that scares me so much about that is that the whole world, Stephen, the whole world now knows what Palestinians have known for 100 years, which is that Israel lies with every breath it takes. And the past 30, 35 years have been defined by nothing, if not, in terms of Palestine, Israel, nothing, if not, the Israelis successfully lying while they busily colonize more and more of the West Bank and put utter paid to Gaza. All of this is the end product of the two-state solution, by the way. I mean, I didn't want to believe it. And, possibly if I were there in 1995 and were old enough to know what was going on, I might have said, or 1994, I might have said, don't be so Eeyore-ish about this. But actually, we are looking at Gaza as it is because Israel has so successfully lied about recognizing a Palestinian state for so long. And so setting Israel conditions really it concerns me in a moral sense, in and of itself, because Palestinian statehood shouldn't be contingent like that. But it also concerns me because I can very easily see Keir Starmer, Macron, Netanyahu, or whoever takes over from him, Trump, just continuing the same charade ad infinitum until we're arguing over a last solitary parcel of land. So, yeah, look, as I say, part of me. Oh, and the other thing, Stephen, one more thing. Israel has demonstrated in vivid technicolor over the past 22 months, has it not, that it can shred every last tenet and article of international law and nobody will do a thing. So why should I believe, or why should we as Palestinians believe, though the end goal has always been Palestinian state sovereignty, why should we believe that sovereignty under these terms will compel Israel to give up on its bloodlust against the Palestinians? I don't see any reason to believe that. Recognizing a Palestinian state as a sovereign thing, as a sovereign state, is technically, really, it's legal terminology. It's a legal development. Okay, fine. Then we turn our attention to everything else in international law that's supposed to have constrained Israel thus far, and we find nothing has. So, yeah, it should be an emotional day. It should be a really fucking emotional day. And we should be able to celebrate this. This began with the British and the French in 1916 with Sykes-Picot. And before that with the British with the Earl of Shaftesbury in the 1840s. I don't see any reason to believe it's going to conclude with them. I suppose if I were to try and eke out a single positive thing from all of this, Stephen, and I want to end on something, clasped to something positive, I would say, but potentially it opens more space for those of us who have genuinely always been committed to Palestinian statehood and rights to put more pressure, to use it as a tiny Trojan horse, if you like, to try and put more pressure on our governments, the governments in Europe and so on.
Yeah, you're completely right about that point about, recognition of Palestinian statehood being irrelevant, right? Because, no matter what kind of structure you create there, Israel's shown that it can break those international structures with complete impunity. And, if Israel is indeed, which it appears to be, in the business of doing genocide, of doing extermination, of doing mass transfer of people and ethnic cleansing, then setting a threat of creating a Palestinian state in September simply now gives them a deadline in which to complete that project, because you can't create a state when there aren't any people there to inhabit it. And I just want to say one more thing, which I find extremely strange about this statement of Keir Starmer's. Unlike Macron, who just said, we will recognize it in September. Again, he put it to a deadline down the road. But this conditional statement of Starmer's, it has this strange, bizarre European logic, which kind of applies to this little piece of land in the Middle East, which is that in order to have a state there, you have to have survived a genocide. That's the logic that was applied earlier in the 20th century and which is being applied now when there's a question of Palestinian statehood at this juncture in time. Very, very bizarre announcement, a very, very bizarre conditional there. Now, Starmer's incredibly odd announcement comes in the context of US President Donald Trump breaking with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu over the Israel-enforced starvation of Gaza. At a rambling 70-minute press conference with Starmer at Trump's Turnberry Golf Resort in Scotland on Monday, the US president was asked about the deteriorating situation in Gaza.
Next time you speak to Netanyahu, what will you ask him to do?
Well, I'm going to say, look, we're giving money and we're giving food, but we're over here and we're over in the United States, and I think I can speak for the Prime Minister. We're giving money and things. He's got to sort of run it. Well, I want them to make sure they get the food. I want to make sure they get the food, every ounce of food. I think you want the same
absolutely.
thing.
It's an absolute focus.
Because that food isn't being delivered, or at least all of it.
Trump's demand that Israel let in every ounce of food came after Benjamin Netanyahu said this earlier in the day.
There is no starvation in Gaza, no policy of starvation in Gaza, and I assure you that we have a commitment to achieve our war goals. We'll continue to fight till we achieve the release of our hostages and the destruction of Hamas's military and governing capabilities. They shall be there no more.
Well, not only is there absolutely Israel-enforced starvation occurring in Gaza, but UN-backed famine monitor, the IPC, has now released a report saying that famine thresholds have been reached for food consumption in most of Gaza. This is from that report. The worst-case scenario of famine is currently playing out in the Gaza Strip. Conflict and displacement have intensified, and access to food and other essential items and services has plummeted to unprecedented levels. Mounting evidence shows that widespread starvation, malnutrition, and disease are driving a rise in hunger-related deaths. Latest data indicates that famine thresholds have been reached for food consumption in most of the Gaza Strip and for acute malnutrition in Gaza City. The IPC has also released projections of acute food insecurity in Gaza up until the end of September. As you can see in the graphic on screen, every single area of the Strip is in a level 4 emergency, while also being at risk of famine. The IPC's report also said that Gaza has teetered on the brink of famine for 2 years, and that now nearly 17 out of every 100 children under the age of 5 are acutely malnourished. That's almost a fifth of them. However, the IPC has not been able to formally declare a famine in Gaza due to a lack of access to and mobility within the area for essential data gathering. Nearly 150 Palestinians have died due to malnutrition during Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza, and this number includes 88 children. And by the way, most of those have happened in the last few weeks. Babies and children are the least equipped to deal with severe food shortages, and malnutrition in babies and children can have catastrophic consequences for their cognitive development and central nervous systems. But Israeli politicians continue to deny the crisis. This is Israel's Foreign Minister, Gideon Sa'ar.
It is clear that after almost 2 years of war, the situation is tough. But there is a lie, and the lie is the starvation policies which the international media, including BBC, is cooperating with.
In response to growing international condemnation of the graphic footage of starvation coming from Gaza right into our phone screens, Israel announced a so-called temporary humanitarian pause and started making small aid drops into the Strip on Saturday. The Israeli military claims that 52 aid packages were dropped into Gaza today in coordination with Jordan, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates. France and the UK are reportedly keen to get involved in the airdrops, which have been condemned by humanitarian organisations and the UN as expensive, inefficient, and dangerous to vulnerable and starving civilians. In central Gaza's Al-Zawaidah, this is how Palestinians describe the airdrops.
This aid is disgraceful. We are not dogs to be made to run after aid. People fought over it. We'd rather die of hunger with dignity than die in humiliation and filth.
Medical staff say more than 62 Palestinians have been killed since dawn today, including 19 people trying to access aid. Gaza's health ministry recorded 14 new deaths on Monday due to famine and malnutrition over the past 24 hours. And today it confirmed that the number of Palestinians killed during 662 days of Israel's genocide has reached a really shocking 60,000. And this number is, of course, a very conservative one and likely an undercount due to the people whose bodies remain trapped under the rubble. Israeli violence against Palestinians hasn't, of course, been confined just to the Gaza Strip either. Auda Hathlin, a prominent 31-year-old journalist and activist who worked on the Oscar-winning documentary No Other Land, has been killed in an attack by Israeli settlers in the West Bank. In this footage, the Israeli settler holding and firing a gun is believed to be Yinon Levy, who was later arrested by Israeli police for questioning. No charges have so far been filed against him. Yinon Levy is a recognized extremist settler and was sanctioned by the US under President Joe Biden, sanctions which were then lifted by Donald Trump. According to eyewitnesses from the village of al-Keir, a settler in a bulldozer drove over their land, destroying trees and damaging property. A resident approached to ask the bulldozer driver to stop. The driver knocked him down with the blade of the machine. Residents started to throw stones, and Levy allegedly emerged from the settlement and started shooting indiscriminately. No Other Land's Palestinian director Bassel Adra posted this on X. I can hardly believe it. My dear friend Auda was slaughtered this evening. He was standing in front of the community centre in his village when a settler fired a bullet that pierced his chest and took his life. This is how Israel erases us, one life at a time. More than 1,000 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli violence in the West Bank over the past 22 months. Kieran, a real picture there of a deteriorating situation, not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank too, as military violence in Gaza intensifies and spreads along with starvation, and settler violence spreads in the West Bank. How does this all make you feel?
Yeah, I mean, it makes me feel very wretched, in a word. As I know it does so many of our, or all of our viewers and listeners, and I know as it does you, Stephen, and all of our colleagues. I think, it's right that the world's eyes are on Gaza. But yes, a net is tightening around, is closing in around the West Bank and has been for a very long time. And, what I was referring to about the two-state solution being a form of window dressing to allow for the status quo as it now looks in the West Bank is pertinent here, I think. I just want to say briefly on Trump, we could make a lot out of Trump's comments, breaking with Netanyahu. And it's tempting to say that with Trump, we're back to the old conundrum. What does it all mean? You need to be a sort of chaos theorist or, I don't know, a scholar of abstract expressionist art in order to make sense of the patterns and the meaning. But actually, I think it's much more simple than that. I don't think it really means anything. I think it's just business as usual. We've been here before. We've seen Trump say about Iran and Israel, they don't know what the fuck they're doing. And people got excited about that. And, I understand, as I said on the day that I co-hosted Novara Live, that he said that having a US president say fuck and Israel in the same sentence is very gratifying. But it didn't mean anything ultimately, did it? Because Netanyahu then went to Washington and bestowed upon him all manner of blandishments and things were back to normal. The special relationship was as it's ever been. And, this is a president who we're often told that for good or for ill is different. And obviously, very often it's for ill, and sometimes you might say even that it's for good. But one way in which he is absolutely cast iron, consistent with every US president and every US president's administration over the past 4 or 5 decades is that he, despite pearl clutching occasionally, despite the odd performative rhetorical condemnation, he always rallies behind Israel. And the degree to which he rallies, you could argue, is unprecedented. But he always rallies behind Israel. And in that, he is absolutely cut from the same cloth as every other US president over the past 4 or 5 decades. He always gives Israel a blank check to do whatever it wants to feed its bloodlust against the Palestinian people. And so, I don't think that Trump saying that really means anything, and it should be taken as a meaningless moment in time. And, maybe I'll be wrong. It's pertinent to say, if Trump tomorrow, Stephen, forces all the aid that's amassed on the border into Gaza, even if he personally goes down there and breaks down the walls to get that aid in, he will still be a filthy war criminal with the blood of Palestinians soaked through him for the rest of his hopefully short remaining life.
I have a breaking news update for you now. It comes from the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's a short statement on Keir Starmer's announcement about the conditionality of a Palestinian state. And it says, Israel rejects the statement by the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. The shift in the British government's position at this time, following the French move and internal political pressures, constitutes a reward for Hamas and harms efforts to achieve a ceasefire in Gaza and a framework for the release of hostages. What efforts? What efforts to achieve a ceasefire in Gaza? What a load of nonsense. Israel has intercepted the Gaza-bound humanitarian vessel Handala, a Freedom Flotilla ship seeking to break Israel's deadly and illegal blockade of the enclave with a cargo of supplies, including baby formula. Israeli troops boarded the vessel on Saturday night, seized the aid and detained those on board in what the Freedom Flotilla coalition described as a kidnapping of the Handala's crew in international waters. These, of course, are scenes eerily reminiscent of what happened to the crew of the previous Freedom Flotilla ship, the Madeleine, in June, which notably included Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg. On board the Handala were 19 activists and 2 journalists from various countries, including Australia, France, the UK, and the US. One of those activists is Palestinian-American human rights lawyer Huwaida Arraf, who made the Handala's aims very clear to an IDF soldier over the phone.
And we are sailing lawfully in international waters where you have no jurisdiction, have no lawful jurisdiction, starving civilians. Any blockade that starves civilians or has a disproportionate harmful effect on a civilian population is illegal. And therefore you have no authority to enforce an illegal blockade. And as such, you are not permitted to use any kind of force to enforce an illegal blockade. We demand that you stand down, that you not attack the civilian vessel that is carrying only humanitarian aid. Why are you afraid of baby formula and teddy bears that are destined for the children of Gaza? You spew your propaganda about Hamas. This vessel carries food and baby formula for children that your government is deliberately starving. Your blockade is deliberately starving children to death. You have no authority to enforce an illegal blockade. This is a war crime. You are responsible for the health, well-being, and safety of all civilians aboard this vessel, and any attack on us is a violation of international law for which you will be held accountable by the international community.
Despite that impassioned laying out of the international law situation, Israeli soldiers, surprise, surprise, boarded the ship anyway and seized its cargo of baby formula, nappies, food and medicine, all terribly dangerous things. And once its crew had been taken to an Israeli prison, one activist was reportedly subjected to actually pretty appalling violence. Chris Smalls is an American union organizer, and he's the former head of the Amazon Labor Union and one of the most high-profile figures on the Handler. He was reportedly choked and kicked by Israeli personnel while in detention. The Freedom Flotilla coalition posted this on X. When he reached the Israeli prison, US human rights defender Chris Smalls was physically assaulted by 7 uniformed individuals. They choked him and kicked him in the legs, leaving visible signs of violence on his neck and back. When his lawyer met with him, Chris was surrounded by 6 members of Israel's special police unit. This level of force was not used against other abducted activists. We condemn this violence against Chris and demand accountability for the assault and discriminatory treatment he faced. 14 volunteers from Handala who refused to agree to an expedited deportation process from Israel are still in Israeli detention, and all 14 are now on hunger strike. Now, earlier today, I spoke to Huwaida Arraf, who you saw in that video call from the Handala to the IDF, and I began by asking her to describe what happened on Saturday night.
By Saturday, we had been sailing aboard the Handala towards Gaza for 7 days, and we were nearing the port of Gaza, our destination. We were about 70 miles out. The sun was beginning to set, and we knew that if Israel was going to attack, it would be in the dark, as that's how they usually attack us. Now, during the day, we had read in the Israeli media that Israel was saying it was going to give the flotilla the opportunity to turn around, and if it did not turn around, then it would seize the ship. The thing is, Israel had not tried contacting us at all by any means. And in previous times, they had reached out to us on the VHF radio. So I was proactive about reaching out to them. And I started radioing to the Israeli Navy. They did not respond. A few times I tried, they did not come in. So I just continued to, knowing that they could hear us on the VHF radio channel 16, I said loud and clear that the Handala ship is a civilian vessel that is unarmed. It's carrying 21 civilians from over 10 different countries, including parliamentarians and elderly. We only have humanitarian aid, including baby formula, for the people of Gaza that the Israeli government is deliberately starving to death, and calling on the Israeli Navy not to use any kind of force against us, that we do not constitute any threat to them. We carry baby formula for starving children, and not to use any force against us or to try to intercept us in any way. I also explained that their blockade of Gaza is unlawful. Again, they did not respond to us repeatedly. Then finally, maybe after an hour, the Israeli Navy did come on the phone with a response, spewing some propaganda about the threat of Hamas, and that they have a lawful naval blockade in place, and that they will take action to defend the closure of their naval blockade in accordance with international law. This was absolutely obnoxious because their blockade and their siege on Gaza is by all measures unlawful. It was unlawful when it was imposed in 2006 as a means of collective punishment, because collective punishment is a war crime. And then in 2010, an independent UN investigatory body found that it was unlawful because even as a military tactic, Israel as an occupying power should not be using military tactics against people that they occupy, but even as a military tactic, it was causing disproportionate harm on a civilian population, so that makes it unlawful. And it's even more unlawful today when it's being used as a tool of their genocide to impose deliberate starvation. So I had to shoot back at them to say, let me give you a lesson in international law and explain that by no means is their blockade legal. It is being used to deliberately starve a civilian population. And it is not only unlawful, it is a war crime. And that means that they have no lawful authority to enforce an illegal blockade. And they cannot use any kind of force to enforce an illegal blockade. So I called on them again to stand down and allow us to proceed safely to Gaza. Shortly thereafter, they cut communications. They jammed our VHF. It became all staticky. I couldn't call out anymore. Our GPS was jammed and our internet was cut. It was dark. We had no more communications. And then we noticed we all took our positions. We noticed we were surrounded by Israeli war vessels, and we knew that boarding our vessel was imminent. So we took our positions, and as frightening as the situation may seem, we were 21 civilians up against one of the most powerful militaries in the world that surround us with their naval vessels and cut off all of our means of communication. I can honestly say that we felt strong. We felt determined. We felt that we were in a much stronger position than they were, just because of we believed very much in what we were fighting for, and they're fighting for starvation and genocide, and we are fighting for a world where that is not allowed to happen. They proceeded to take over our vessel. Dozens of armed and masked soldiers took over the boat, just dumped on the boat with their weapons. Each one was carrying a variety of different weapons. They were all masked, so we couldn't see their faces. And they were carrying also cameras. They had almost as many cameras as they had soldiers, and we knew that that was for their propaganda campaign. So they started telling us not to worry, that we will be okay, and they have food and water for us, which we knew that they would try to do. And we told them loud and clear that we are not taking anything, especially not food and water, from an entity that is denying the same to Palestinians in Gaza. They are deliberately starving Palestinian children and then trying to show the world that they are humanitarian by offering us food and water. We don't want it. Our lives are not more important than the children that are starving to death in Gaza. But they were trying to force their food on us, literally putting it in front of us and taking video footage. At that point, we had no more control of the ship. They proceeded to search all of us, take all of our belongings, and then steer the ship towards the Israeli port of Ashdod. So we were kidnapped, taken against our will from international waters, and taken into Israeli custody. It took about, we had no phones and no watches, no anything to be able to tell time, but I think it took about 10 hours before we got to the Israeli port, at which point they were all police, I don't even know, dozens and dozens of police officers and police and military cameras to film us. After that, it was mainly administrative. We started chanting Free Palestine, and they took me and another person off first because we were Israeli citizens and they had to deal with us differently. They can't deport us. The one of our volunteers was treated unnecessarily roughly. We don't know the extent yet to which he was roughed up, but Chris Smalls did suffer unnecessarily violence. He was the only African American amongst us, so there was an element of racism in how he was treated. We were then, I did not see my colleagues after that at all, except for my one colleague that also had Israeli citizenship. They tried to charge us with, they said the charges were unlawful entry into Israel and an attempt to enter an evacuated area and stay there without a permit. I think by that they meant the area, the blockaded area.
Huwaida, now you're an Israeli citizen, as is one of your crewmates, and both of you were released yesterday without any conditions. Why was that?
They had no legal basis by which to attack us or to take control of our ship in international waters where they have no jurisdiction. They brought us against our will into Israel. That's not where we were going. So yes, that they actually have no legal authority in no case. However, Israeli courts are not a place to get justice. Israeli courts are not a place that abide by and respect international law. And Israeli courts frequently just rubber stamp government decisions. Very infrequently, they rule against the government, but for the most part, if they decided to charge us, I don't really have faith that we would have gotten much justice in Israeli courts. And so they could have taken it to court and argued it there and probably been pretty confident that the courts would have agreed with them. I think then, though, the case would have gone just beyond the Israeli courts and also into the international court of public opinion in terms of what they're doing. So I think they know the longer they prolong this, if they really wanted to prosecute us, then it would also be prolonged in the court of public opinion internationally. So if I'm going to guess what they wanted to do, which I don't usually try to put to guess how they're thinking because they're not rational at all. But it seems like they wanted to get rid of us. So they wanted to get rid of the Israeli citizens and they wanted to deport the internationals as quickly as possible to shut this down. Because what it is really is they sent out at least 7, 8 naval warship and dozens of armed masked soldiers to stop baby formula from getting into Gaza. This is while they tell the world that there's no starvation in Gaza and they are not starving Gaza, but all of that force to stop baby formula from getting into Gaza. So I think that they wanted to kind of shut this down and get rid of people as quickly as possible.
Now, I think 14 of your crewmates remain in Israeli captivity. They're refusing voluntary deportation, and a number of them have been on hunger strike. What can you tell me about their conditions?
Yes, all of them who were taken to Israeli prison, well, all of us, we were on hunger strike from the moment they took over our boats, from the moment the Israeli Navy seized our boat. We went on immediate hunger strike, and those who went to Israeli prison continue to be on hunger strike, not taking anything from the occupying forces. A number of people have been deported already. By the end of today, there will probably be only 7 people left in Israeli captivity. 7 of my colleagues left in Israeli captivity. I know that 2 of them were deported to Amman and were not able to board their flight to Australia. They are Australian citizens because they were physically too weak and they had to be taken to a hospital and are now being treated in an Amman hospital. We are, again, all of this unnecessary force and violence and treatment because civilians, internationals, were opposing a deliberate starvation campaign, because internationals were trying to deliver baby formula to starving children, who the whole world sees the photos and the videos of children being starved to death. And what is so outrageous about this, we know that Israel does this. It has been doing it. We know that Israel wants to get rid of Palestinians. That is their goal. That they are a settler colonial entity and they have been engaged in this for decades. They have only escalated because of decades of impunity that our governments, the international community, has afforded them. And even now with this action, our governments have legitimized what Israel has done. And just to give you an example of some of the subtle ways in which this is done, on the day of the Israeli attack and the day before, some of our European participants, our volunteers on board, were receiving calls and messages from their consular officials saying that they have been in touch with the Israeli Foreign Ministry and they expect that Israel will take control of our boat and we will be brought to Ashdod, and not to worry because the consulate will provide them with consular services. That is just an outrageous message to be getting from our governments, because they are legitimizing Israeli piracy in the Mediterranean. They are legitimizing Israel abducting us from international waters when we were sailing lawfully in international waters on a peaceful mission. Israel had no jurisdiction, no right, and its actions violate numerous international laws. But instead of our governments protesting this and telling Israel to stand down and not to touch this vessel, especially the United Kingdom that had a UK citizen on board and that flagged this ship. So our ship was sovereign UK territory. None of these governments said anything. They are legitimizing over and over again Israel's violations of international law. I mean, thank you for providing consular services, but what we'd like you to do is uphold international law and stop allowing this rogue state to commit these crimes against humanity that they are committing. But that's what we are dealing with. That's what we want to continue to expose. And I think that more people's eyes are opened to this, especially with this Handala ship, because it was a ship for children. People are tired and horrified seeing the mutilated, beheaded, and now starved children in Gaza, and a small boat that constituted no threat to anyone and was carrying baby formula, other food, medicine, and donated teddy bears from Italian children to children in Gaza, that such military force would be used to stop it. Under what pretext? This is the government, this is the state that we're supporting with our weapons and our tax dollars. This is the United States' greatest ally that we give billions and billions of dollars to. American citizens, as I'm sure citizens all over the world, are horrified. And what I can say is Israel can do whatever it wants to us. We're not going to stop. We're not going to stop trying to break the siege of Gaza and not only end the genocide, but end the occupation and colonization, because at the end of the day, it's not humanitarian aid that Gaza needs. Gaza and Palestine needs their freedom.
Now, that was only a part of a longer interview with Huwaida. In the rest of that interview, I talked to her about her first experience on a Gaza Freedom Flotilla, which was in 2010, when she was part of the flotilla that was stormed by the IDF, resulting in the killing of 9 people. And she also talks to me about what it's like to leave your children behind, to go on a voyage to break a siege, which, you know, potentially puts your life at risk. So we'll be putting the full interview out later tonight around 9 o'clock on the channel. Kieran, earlier you spoke a bit about despair at the situation, and I wanted to offer you that interview as a kind of counterpoint to that despair. I mean, don't get me wrong, I feel that despair, and I'm sure, without doubt, you feel it so much more acutely than I do. But I think when I hear people like Huwaida talk about the courage of herself and her crewmates and their determination to not only break the siege, but to shine a spotlight on what is the crime of our lifetime taking place in front of our eyes right now. Or when I think about the Hind Rajab Foundation, whose volunteers go out, find people who are culpable in this genocide and try to hold them to account. Or when I think of Zara Sultana and Jeremy Corbyn and our independent MPs who've remained vocal throughout the last nearly 2 years in Parliament trying to hold our government to account. Or when I think of Defend Our Juries and the people going out on protests, getting themselves arrested and potentially charged with terror legislation because they're protesting the prescription of Palestine action by this government. Or when I think of the countless numbers of people who either attend the marches on week in and week out just to be present, being recorded as someone who disagrees with what is happening in Palestine, and even people who can't make the marches, but who sort of hold in their communities the disgust, the anger, the rage at the grotesque treatment that Israel is meting out to Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank. That fills me with a kind of hope that sort of edges despair out. And I wonder if it's the same for you.
Well, first of all, Stephen, I think that's one of the best interviews I've ever seen on Novara Live. And the second thing to say is, you're absolutely right. No, there's no despair in the long run. I think we're going to win this. Sorry to put it in those slightly glib terms, but I think Palestine will be free. And I think there will be a Palestinian state. Exactly what that looks like, I don't know. But I am very confident that if we keep doing what we're doing, that one day this will all be over. And so you're absolutely right. For all the reasons that you've just outlined, there is no room for despair or nihilism. There's only space for continued effort. And of course, I have dark days. And of course, you do. And many people listening to this and watching this will recognize that as well. But we have to pick ourselves up. We have to carry on. And I just want to give, echo one of the reasons you've just articulated, Stephen, which is around international solidarity. But I want to start. And actually, I just want to say, sorry to go back. The interviewee, this will come to an end and Palestine will be free because of Palestinian struggle, first and foremost, because of international resistance, and absolutely because of women like her. Absolutely inspirational. Incredible. And I tell you, I've done many Novara Lives. I've never been so close to tears as when she said the words teddy bears through her megaphone. Inspiring, and I will personally build a statue of her in a free Palestine when that happens. But I do want to say something about Israel generally, because obviously she is massively the exception. And then I want to link that to another cause for hope. Israel is the most racist society on earth right now. And Israelis, by and large, are the most racist people on earth right now. I wish it weren't so. I'm not saying it for effect, and I hope it isn't so in the future. But I think for the time being, that's just a plain fact. And lest we forget that though it was widely denied at the time, and indeed Rebecca Long-Bailey lost her position in the shadow cabinet for sharing something to its effect, it's widely known and widely documented that Israeli police and American police share tactics and seminars and so on. Ask any Palestinian, either firsthand or through, as in themselves, or through first-hand observation, they don't recognize, they aren't well acquainted with the knee on the neck technique of Israeli police against them. And so there's a continuum here, which I think speaks to the kind of the unlikely or counterintuitive positive thing I want to say, the cause for hope. There's a continuum here which shows the kind of universality of the anti-racist struggle, right? It's, of course, the majority of Israeli racism is decanted into or focused on Palestinians. But actually, that's just circumstantial. Palestinians just happen to be the ones who are there. When you build a society on the premise that you are racially superior to everybody, and that has God's blessing, no less. But of course, it doesn't take a rocket scientist or even a sociologist to work out that produces individuals who think that they can treat human beings like animals are treated in an abattoir. But the universality of that anti-racist struggle must be at the forefront of our minds. And unfortunately, it's evoked in the heroic figure of Chris Smalls on this occasion. And there will be others in the future, I fear. But as long as we remember and recognize that interlinkedness of the anti-racist struggle around Palestine and way beyond, then I think we can sublimate something incredibly ugly into something forceful and potent.
I think that was incredibly beautifully said, Kieran. Thank you. On Friday, the new Online Safety Act came into force in the UK. Introduced by the Tories in 2023, the bill, as it was then, brings in compulsory age verification checks for online content that the government believes could be harmful to children. That includes pornography of all kinds, as well as material that relates to self-harm, eating disorders, or suicide. But one consequence of the act is that content that almost certainly shouldn't have been censored has been. Earlier this year, Tory MP Katie Lamb made a speech in Parliament about child sexual exploitation. In it, she gave some graphic details of the ordeals young girls had undergone. But footage of that speech was briefly disappeared from X after the act came into force. The Wikimedia Foundation, the non-profit that operates Wikipedia, is challenging the law, arguing that regulations endanger Wikipedia and the global volunteer contributors who create the site's pages, often anonymously. And also last week, footage of protesters being arrested by police outside a hotel housing asylum seekers in Leeds also appeared to be blocked on X. Now, look, I think when it comes to X, given Elon Musk's previous political statements, it wouldn't be at all surprising to find that the platform was overzealously applying the law in order to flame anti-government sentiment amongst its users. But if that's true, it also just shows how susceptible the law is to manipulation by big tech firms. Now, in response to the law, Brits have been downloading VPNs in massive numbers. That allows them to bypass UK verification checks by making it appear that they're accessing sites from outside the UK. 5 VPNs are amongst the top 10 apps being downloaded from the Apple Store in the UK right now. But according to one caller to LBC, the use of VPNs can bring their own privacy concerns.
What will happen is scenarios previously where these children were visiting things in the open and could be tracked are now being obfuscated through things like VPNs and other programs such as this that will be offered by states such as China, Russia, and our children will be routed through these because the UK government doesn't control the internet. It controls some of the internet, but it's a worldwide platform. They are putting all of their unencrypted information through those pipelines. That could be passwords, usernames, information about their personal life, alcoholism, pornography, all these kinds of things that could be used to control them and manipulate them. These are all being routed through actors who do not have our state interest at heart. I cannot believe this got through the intelligence services oversight.
Well, I mean, I'm not wanting to offend you. I can't believe you're right, because it did.
I can't really believe what you're telling me, because surely the state would just protect us at every turn. It's really hard for me to believe that the state wouldn't protect us or might make an error that made things harder for us. I mean, look, I know James O'Brien laughed at the end there. I think he was kind of speaking tongue in cheek, but it is a sort of classic kind of liberal sentiment that, it can't happen to us. We're a really advanced and progressive democracy, a liberal democracy. Now, a large factor behind the introduction of the bill by the Tories was the tragic death of London teenager Molly Russell. The 14-year-old took her life after being exposed to a stream of dark, depressing content on Pinterest and Instagram, with an inquest later ruling that she ended her life while suffering from depression and the negative effects of online content. Many online platforms have since said they've developed online tools to limit access to harmful material. But, come on. If you're like me, someone who uses a lot of those platforms that algorithmically select content, you'll know that just a few clicks out of curiosity can still lead you to being suddenly flooded with waves of very bleak material or otherwise unwanted material. And I think that there's also no doubt that pornography is having an insidious effect on young boys, and therefore on young girls too. Ofcom recently found that 8% of children aged 8 to 14 had visited an online pornography site or app over a month-long period. So look, it isn't like there aren't problems to be solved here when it comes to the protection of young people. The question is whether this bill is the right tool for the job. Earlier today, I spoke to Dr. Kate Sim. She specializes in children's online protection. She is also the program director of Children's Online Safety and Privacy Research, or COPSA, at the University of Western Australia. And I began by asking her whether trading adult users' privacy for online child safety was worth it.
Yeah, so the question, and I think the common narrative when it comes to this act, the Online Safety Act, is that it's a fight between children's safety versus adults' privacy. And I really take issue with that. And I'm coming at it from as somebody who has been researching the intersection of sexual violence and technology for over a decade. And I have 15 years of experience in working in sexual violence prevention and response, particularly involving young people on the front lines and in advocacy. And I now direct a research program called COSPER on children's online safety and privacy, where I investigate kind of political economy of this growing space of children's online safety. And actually, from the standpoint of child safety, this act fundamentally misdiagnoses what is harmful about online harms. So it's not just adults' privacy that's being compromised through this act, it's also young people's privacy and young people's safety. It really is a policy of digital abstinence.
So in what ways does it compromise children's and young people's privacy?
Yeah, so what we are seeing, and it's been several days since this act has been implemented, is the kind of disparate effects of its implementation. So actually the kind of harmful content that the act defines, and it defines it into two camps, the primary priority content and the priority content. The primary priority content involves things like explicit pornography, content that encourages, promotes, or provides instructions on things like self-harm, eating disorder, and suicide. And for priority content, it includes bullying, abusive, and hateful content, things that depict serious violence and injury, and so on. And what we are seeing is that a lot of this is being applied to content actually involving things like what's happening in Palestine, and the content that it claims to be preventing from young people's access. And I actually just did a search before hopping on this interview on Reddit. So threads like Israel Exposed is blocked, but threads about sexualizing young schoolgirls, threads about pickup artists are still accessible. So very much the vague language of this act allows for this kind of selective interpretation that isn't even in the spirit of its stated intent.
And what about the impacts on adult privacy? So we've seen in the UK that there's been a massive upswing in the download of VPNs in order to allow adults to browse sites by declaring that they're in another geographic location and therefore bypassing the law. Does that create any privacy issues for those users?
We're absolutely seeing a skyrocketing of VPNs being downloaded. Proton VPN, for example, in the past several days have skyrocketed. And I think one of the unintended consequences as a result is that this is going to funnel users, both young people and old people, to more sites that have less safeguards that are available. You know, if you can't be accessing your community or information from the Reddits and these, bigger companies, albeit with all their problems, they do have safeguards because they're better resourced. But instead, a lot of people are going to be flocking to smaller and less guarded sites.
So what do you think that the upshot of this act is going to be? So if it's not going to protect children, and in fact it's only going to infringe on their privacy while also infringing on the privacy of adults, it doesn't seem in your view that there's any beneficiary to this act.
From the child protection sector, the argument is that this regulation is going to be protecting children, the universal children, from harmful content. But harmful content is really vaguely defined in a way that is clearly selectively being imposed on political dissent. And child safety in the interest of what? Child safety is also very poorly defined. So I think from both the standpoint of best interests of children and also from the standpoint of civil liberties for adults, this act doesn't really do much to protect either. And in fact, I would actually argue that it endangers all users, both young and old, because it bolsters the surveillance business model, the predatory business model that the tech industry has been relying on, which is to collect more information about us. In order for age verification to work, it implements a number of technologies, a lot of sensitive information, a lot of biometric information about us, behavioral data about us. So now platforms have even more treasure trove of data to collect and quantify and commercialize and monetize that in order to estimate about how old we are and determine what kind of digital experience that we're going to have. So this actually doesn't curb the powers of the tech industry. It actually gives them more. And it's also a pretext for the government to expand their surveillance.
I mean, it's interesting what you say there about the sort of surveillance structure, because one of the points that people make is that, small sites which may show some material which is deemed now to be unsafe for young people don't have the resources to put in place the identification or the verification infrastructure that's required. Whereas larger, big tech sites, which are already harvesting our data, now suddenly, it's easy for them. They can afford to put those things in place. And I guess that's where you're suggesting things can really go wrong for users of the internet.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, actually both the small sites and big tech companies actually end up being losers as a result of this act, because big tech companies, now they have to account for, extra costs of working with third-party vendors that specialize in age verification, which is going to create more friction on user experience, which is not ideal for platform companies. And small sites that, have a limited user base are also now going to have to invest additional resources or additional cost to be able to execute age verification. And, for the rationale behind age verification is that by doing it, we're going to create a seamless experience where young people are protected and shielded from harmful content. But actually what this act does and age verification does is by putting the onus of authentication on the end users. So we all know that we have consent fatigue from things like having to click through the cookies as a result of something like the GDPR. And, users are always complaining about how annoying it is when you visit a new website. If you're annoyed by that, it's only going to get worse, because now you have to jump through additional hoops to be able to access basic information about whether it's the news about what's happening or sexual health information or reproductive health information.
And what about political dissent? Do you see the act having an impact on, citizens of the UK, whatever their political beliefs, whether they're on the right or the left or somewhere in between, trying to organize against issues, the government, for example, that they disagree with?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, quote unquote, harmful content, according to this act, is defined really poorly. And it includes things like pro-terror material, which is extremely poorly defined. So now that gives the government a pretext to apply it selectively. And we are seeing it being applied already. I believe on the day of the act, there was a protest in Seacroft, Leeds, that X had prevented access to. And we know from users sharing it that Reddit thread Israel Exposed has been restricted to to users. So we're already seeing this kind of selective application of when the act kicks in.
But presumably you don't disagree with the idea that children accessing pornography, for example, or suicide promotion sites is something that we maybe should protect them from. I mean, just to give you a personal example, I have a 14-year-old daughter, and I don't think she's accessing sites. I mean, I can't say for sure. I'm pretty sure she's not. But I do know that boys around her are. And I've been witness myself to a kind of level of sexual harassment that she's experienced from other 13 and 14-year-old boys who are clearly either getting it themselves via pornography or it's being communicated via access to those kinds of sites. So, it has an impact on people other than the people who are viewing that material. So, I mean, what do you say to someone like me, for example, who is concerned about young boys especially accessing hardcore, violent, pornographic material?
Yeah, absolutely. And, again, I share deep concerns, and absolutely something has to be done about the way that young people are taken advantage of, again, by the predatory businesses of the tech industry. But the first question I would ask is how and why are young people being exposed to or accessing content like that? And when we start asking the questions about the complexity of young people, what we find is that they might be curious about sex because nobody around them is talking about it. Or they are truly being exposed, and often being exposed in websites that are already, have a higher threshold of harmful content. So in the first case, where young people are genuinely curious, to me, that's a symptom of something that we have collectively as adults failed to do. It means that they are not having that conversation with their parents. It means that they are not having that conversation in their school system. And that's no surprise, because under the austerity, we're seeing social services being cut left and right. Parent capacity is being reduced. Schools are not providing comprehensive sex education, especially in light of ongoing war on trans youth. So, that is a symptom of a larger problem of how we are failing young people. And second, if we take that route of how are young people being exposed to harmful content, then we look at the digital ecosystem, and we have to contend with the fact that this is an advertising ecosystem. For example, in the UK Gambling Commission in the past year, they found that young people, about 64% of them are exposed to sports gambling sites pretty regularly. So we see something like these addictive behaviors and harmful content, sensationalist content that's either as a result of the attention economy that we have, or again, these advertisers, being able to share content without any kind of checks and balances to young people. And decades of research have shown that young people should not be exposed to targeted advertising. They should not be subject to algorithmic profiling. And yet these, systemic interventions are the things that I would love to see the Online Safety Act tackle, but instead they're interested in chasing the symptoms. If we remove the symptoms, the root causes still remain the same, which is the advertising, the surveillance business model. And this act doesn't do anything to actually address that.
That was Kate Sim of Children's Online Safety and Privacy Research speaking to me earlier today. And I mean, I tend to think that legislation is such a blunt tool. I mean, drugs are illegal, but kids still take them. Kids who want to find pornography are going to find pornography. Kids who want to find other harmful sites are going to find other harmful sites. And the things to tackle are the desires to do those things, not using legislation to sort of make yourself feel safe about it when you're not actually at all. Parents who suddenly think their kids won't be able to access websites are going to be incredibly shocked when they still manage to do so, because they'll have thought, oh, well, I've now the government has seconded control for me and responsibility from me. And so, I don't need to worry so much. Now, the Online Safety Act has also created a political stir. On Monday, Reform UK leader Nigel Farage vowed to repeal Britain's, quote, dystopian Online Safety Act, saying its suppression of free speech would make Xi Jinping blush. Speaking online, Farage said this. Millions of people have noticed what they're getting on their feeds is different to what it was just last week. It begins to look as though state suppression of genuine free speech may be upon us already. Now, the government's Secretary for Science and Technology, Peter Kyle, has responded, saying this.
I see that Nigel Farage is already saying that he's going to overturn these laws. So, we have people out there who are extreme pornographers, peddling hate, peddling violence. Nigel Farage is on their side. Make no mistake about it, if people like Jimmy Savile were alive today, he'll be perpetrating his crimes online. And Nigel Farage is saying that he's on their side.
I'm sorry.
Not the side of children who are...
I'm going to ask you to clarify. Do you honestly think to say Nigel Farage is on Jimmy Savile's side?
When it comes to online activity, we have seen unfettered access of adults to children via social media. When we put in the age verification, it stops strange adults getting in touch with children. So make no mistake.
This is a major leap. You're going to stick to the fact that you said that Nigel Farage is on Jimmy Savile's side.
Nigel Farage is on the side of turning the clock back to the time when strange adults, strangers, can get in touch via messaging apps with children. We have now asked to age verify the age in which people can have access to online content so we can protect children from unwanted, dangerous content and also those messaging services where people can get access directly to it. Nigel Farage wants to turn the clock right back when all of that, I have absolutely no doubt about it, people are perpetrating more crime online, more danger to children online, and Nigel Farage has said he wants to overturn every single one of the laws that keeps children safe in our country.
Now, Peter Kyle repeated those comments on pretty much every TV show he turned up on, comparing Nigel Farage in some way to Jimmy Savile and also to the defender of hardcore pornographers. And obviously, Kyle was just really thrilled by how clever he thought those comments were. But this is how Nigel Farage described that attack.
Absolutely disgusting. Disgusting. To compare anybody's actions with the vile Jimmy Savile is completely below the belt. Yes, there's to and fro in politics. This was appalling. All I asked for was an apology, and he simply doubled down. And it's a disgrace. And I stand absolutely by what I've said, that children are not being protected. They're signing up for VPNs where they can access content that is even worse than they could have done before this instrument came in. And I'm also, people in glass houses, perhaps he should remember that his own leader, Keir Starmer, had to apologise for not prosecuting Jimmy Savile.
Now, it's pretty unusual for me to find myself on the side of Nigel Farage. I am suspicious that he's motivated by children's interests when he wants to repeal the Online Safety Act. But I think he's right. As I said earlier, I don't think this will actually protect children at all, particularly. But Kieran, just on the politics of this, was that comparison made by Peter Kyle a political own goal?
Just a short reflection from me on this one, Stephen. I think that kind of political hyperbole works a lot better when the person delivering it doesn't sound like somebody auditioning for Sixth Form Debate Society or something. And it's particularly painful listening to Peter Kyle. And I think it obviously backfires or hasn't landed. Farage, Trump, their ilk know how to deliver that kind of hyperbole very, very well. Peter Kyle, less so. I dare say probably most of the Labour front bench, much, much less so. And maybe that says something about the kinds of audiences that they corral as well. Beyond that, I think politically, just one other brief observation, which is of interest, and it's kind of half-formed, it's half-baked for me. But it is interesting that Nigel Farage, has kind of taken up the political space of the Conservative Party. And you could argue some, obviously, aspects of Labour as well. But, he is a man of the right? And the political space that he is very rapidly, it seems, moving into is the space typically occupied by the right in this country. And of course, historically, you would expect the preeminent figure on the British political right to be very much on the side of the sort of moral panic, anti-pornography, moral panic kind of thing. and the kind of side of things. We've got a long tradition of that in this country. Mary Whitehouse, campaigner in the 1970s against pornography and television. She considered it all to be the work of the devil. There's a long, rich tradition in this country of kind of curtain-twitching social conservatism that sees the devil under every single bedstead and thinks that there's that every new attitude in society is worthy of a moral panic. And actually, I think it is interesting. And I said it's half-formed because I don't exactly know what it means. People listening, viewing might have a view, might not. I don't know what it means that the kind of preeminent figure on the British right at the moment is actually taking the more kind of libertarian stance on it all, and not the kind of traditional social conservative position on it.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point about libertarianism and Farage because, in the absence of a kind of libertarian left party, Farage has also been able to claim the kind of libertarianism, the kind of like quest for freedom that is common to a lot of people who don't want to be inhibited by the state, who don't want the state to be controlling their social and their communal activities. Many of them are on the left, and or maybe they don't have a political home necessarily, but they do believe in a sort of freedom. And Farage has managed to capture quite a lot of them because there hasn't been an answer on the left, which also engages in a kind of libertarianism, a kind of suspicion of corporations and the state and what they can do when they join together, and which makes me all the more hopeful for the new left party. I think there's fertile ground for them to claim on this very topic of a kind of libertarian approach to the state. Anyway, that's for another time. Thank you, Kieran, so much for joining me tonight. This has been great.
It's been phenomenal. I've really enjoyed it, Stephen. I feel frazzled. Me and my cold are now going to go home and rest.
Yeah, we'll let you get home and get some Lucozade in you. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Please come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.